Welcome to our September Mortgage Quality and Compliance Committee webinar. We appreciate you tuning in and joining us this morning. My name is Samantha Gallagher. I'm the Member Engagement Director here at the California MBA. If you have not joined us previously, we host these webinars on a monthly basis. So we usually cover a wide variety of compliance and quality assurance topics for the residential lending industry. If you're a member of our association and you'd like to join one of our committees or take part in coming up with content and speakers that join us for our webinar series, please feel free to reach out to me and I can get you plugged into that. And now I'd like to turn it over to our chair of our MQAC committee, Michael Steer. He will introduce our wonderful presenters that we have this morning and the webinar that we have prepared for you. Mike, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Welcome to this month's MQAC webinar. My name is Mike Steer, president of MQMAR. I'm honored to serve as the MQAC chair this year, along with our vice chair, Melissa Copel, who's managing partner of regulatory affairs at Loan Depot. We've already had a full year of awesome webinars, but before we jump into today's webinar and introduce the speakers, I just want to remind everyone that registration is open for our Legal Issues and Regulatory Compliance Conference. That's December 11th to 12th in Irvine, California. And we do have a few remaining spots for sponsorship. So if you're interested in sponsoring or registering, check out the California MBA website. Reach out to anyone at the California MBA or me, and we're happy to get you details. Now, today we're talking about adapting return to office policies as our expert panel will share their insights about the dynamic changes in the work environment, the challenges of managing remote and in-house teams, and MLO enhanced requirements in California and other states. Now, as we've probably experienced in some form working remotely these past few years, such as, do I wear pants or no pants today? Do I wear shoes or no shoes today? Do I run a load of laundry during a break, or even remembering to take a break, which could also have some compliance implications? Or, hey, Bob, you're on mute, we can't hear you. There's obviously been a lot of changes in the way we work, and as it relates to compliance, what the states will allow, so pay close attention. Now, a little bit about our speakers. So Alessandra Whipple is a partner in the Orange County office of CDF Labor Law, a California-based labor and employment defense firm with offices throughout the state. Her practice focuses on defending employers and management in labor and employment matters in California state and federal courts and a broad range of employment claims, including claims of discrimination, retaliation, harassment, wrongful termination, and wage and hour litigation. She also regularly advises executives and HR personnel on preventative measures, which is very important, to avoid litigation in the first place. And our second speaker, Tim Lang, he oversees, approves technology-enabled services that assist companies obtaining and maintaining state-required licenses and working with clients on state examinations. He was instrumental in the development and launch of Approved, now a division of Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. And prior to joining Approved, Tim spent 9 years working at the Conference of State Bank Supervisors as its Senior Director of Policy, where he focused his efforts on policy and system development for state regulatory agencies. Now, while at CSBS, Tim led external stakeholder engagement for NMLS 2.0, and he also managed and worked on the SAFE Act implementation in NMLS, the expanded use of NMLS for money transmitter, debt collector, consumer lender, and other non-mortgage licenses, as well as the development of the first nationwide electronic surety bond platform. A native of Chicago, Tim holds a Bachelor of Business Administration degree with a concentration in accounting from Loyola University Chicago and a Master of Public Administration degree from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Now, I will hand it over to Alessandra and Tim, who I am assuming are probably wearing shoes, maybe pants, but you'll never know because you can only see them from the top up. And they're going to talk about return to office and adapting policies. So go ahead and take it away, Tim and Alessandra. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks Samantha, and thanks Michael for that good introduction. And I wanted to make sure I had a special call out for Melissa here with a mention of the electronic surety bonds that were launched several years ago, something that she and I like to continue to talk about. No, thanks again for this. Hopefully we'll have a good conversation today and I think you have a ability to ask us questions through the chat, as Samantha had mentioned. I want to talk about some of the big issues here. We've bucketed into like three distinct areas on the next slide that will kind of help guide our conversation, at least my conversation here, to talk about our topic today. One of the big things, 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, this was, not really a topic of conversation about, all of these things that we're now facing about return to work. The assumption was you were in 5 days a week, you were wearing shoes, all of the things that Michael talked about, and that, changed very quickly. And, just going remote was a big thing. Companies and individuals adapted, I think, pretty quickly. I think especially in the mortgage industry, did a really great job showing regulators in particular that they can manage this potential new risk. There was a lot of concern around there. I think the industry in particular did a good job from that perspective, understanding what needed to be done and implementing different policies and procedures in the moment to continue operating, but also being adaptable. And now that, a lot of companies are returning to the office, I think there's a good number of things that we should really consider. First is, what is the impact here, especially with new entrants, folks who are, starting in the workforce. What is their experience? For many folks, we may have hired them during the pandemic and they were remote, and now they have to come into the office. They've missed out, in my opinion, on a lot of that in-office interaction that I've seen really help build teams into a more productive and really catapult them further along. So I think that one of the things as you're considering, the return to office, really focusing on new entrants, what is their experience? If, I came, from a long career, I was a person who was not, never really understood why folks would work remote. I liked being in the office, and that changed pretty quickly, and now I'm back in the office, not full time, 3 days a week, 3 out of 5 days a week, and something that I didn't think would happen, or even I would want to do 5 years ago, 4 years ago. For those that have only had that single experience where they're working from home, this is a new thing for them. But I think there's a lot of experience for us that have been in all the worlds, been in both worlds, to really help them out again with that exposure and provide that direct experience.
And I'd say to sort of piggyback off of that from an employment perspective, when you're going through the application hiring process and those offer letters, making it very clear sort of what the expectations are for the employees, because that is typically where you can start to see some red flags early on in an employment relationship where, well, why can't I be remote? Or I moved to another state under the belief that I could, the position was remote, and then that tension between not communicating necessarily the expectations of what the position requires, but setting that forth in the offer letter, and then not just that, but also enforcing it, because that's also where you can run into some issues. If, say, it is a 3-day-a-week or a 2-day-a-week in office requirement, and you're kind of haphazardly applying it, so requiring some people who are struggling, not performing as well, and then not enforcing it with maybe some of the higher performers. While that seems fair, that can also create issues because the lower performers, as we've talked about how great the mortgage industry has adapted to the new normal of remote work, plaintiffs' attorneys are equally as great as exploiting like various arbitrage moments for them, such as a lower performer not being, being picked on because they're not coming into the office as much, and then other people not being held to the same standard. So just even at the outset of the relationship, setting forth the expectations, then holding people accountable to the expectations can save you in the long run.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, we've, I've experienced where, if something isn't spelled out or we think it is spelled out, I've had to question and go back and say, what exactly did we say in the letter? Conversations are one thing, but having there in the letter and what that expectation is. And, I think the more you can repeat, this is, especially if you do require folks in the office during the interview process, and make sure you document that you've said that you need to be in 3 days a week. I think that is a part of the new reality here around, especially with hybrid folks. So yeah, thanks for that. It's a good point.
My ears, document. That is
right, yes. I think we can apply that across on so many things. And that's on the third bullet here. Actually, I think that to the point there about the fair application, because you can have very high performers who and maybe they're new entrants or maybe they are more experienced folks, and some people also have different sort of life situations that may allow you or may require, and you want to be able to provide some different accommodations. Not everybody knows what everyone's situation is, and it can produce this, well, why does this person get to do it? Why can't I do it? I think having an open ability to have a conversation around it is key. I think the more you can be clear about it, obviously, the better. But understand and hopefully over time, where the flexibility has to be there, that becomes apparent and accepted. But you can definitely run into sort of that, how you apply the policy across the board, and questions that come up from folks. One of the other things, and this just happened, the other day with me, and it was pretty poignant for this. Here we are in the office, at least here we're 3 days a week, and we have group meetings, right? Well, here in the Chicago office where I sit, there are 4 or 5 of us that will meet regularly with the rest of the team, which is spread out, across the country in different offices with some full-time remote folks. Well, in the old days, we would all go into a conference room and then get onto a bigger screen and then, share there. Well, we were sitting here and all in our different offices, continuing to act as if we were still at home. So, I've made it very clear that, when we're in the office together, when we have that critical mass, we should be, again, going back into the conference room, being there. And I think it helps build, again, where it's appropriate and just things like that prior to us, being remote, that's what we did all the time. We didn't have necessarily all of the technology and equipment, everyone having individual cameras to do this. And now we have that. I think it's just about being conscious about that. And again, it gets back to, especially with the new entrants, especially with folks that maybe have been out of the office for a while, to help continue to build that. Yes, there are some more technology issues you may run into and, moving your laptop around, but I think it's worth those momentary moments where you have to kind of fix things. The other thing here, just about returning, and the reality is we are seeing from a compliance perspective, the return of on-site exams. During the pandemic, everything was handled remotely, but states are now starting this. So whether you want to be in the office or not, you will have to be there if there's an on-site exam. And in fact, we'll talk about a little bit about the California MLO rules, but in that is embedded that documentation has to be available at a branch location. So again, this is coming back, to the, how things were, maybe not necessarily all of the on-site exams, but you'll have to have folks in the office, and, they may want to interview MLOs. They may want to, interview folks that maybe are on a different schedule and aren't in the office every day. So being aware that there are going to be business needs that require that, especially from the regulator's perspective, is key. There's been a lot of conversations about, can you be more productive in the office or out of the office? Do you get distracted with that load of laundry that Michael was talking about when you're at home? Or do you get distracted because you're in the office and everybody wants to talk to you about different things? I think all of those are, good topics of conversation. I don't think anything is settled. There's a lot of studies that are out there. One study will say this, one study will say the opposite, or somewhere in between is probably where the truth is. Does somebody need to be in the office just for their motivation? I think there's a lot to be said there, as well as, the focus around mental health. Being, by yourself, especially if you live alone or whatever, being remote only, can cause different issues. I mean, we've seen that, but it is something just to be aware of. And especially if you're a manager, especially if you are a business owner, these are the new reality that 4 years ago you probably didn't think about as much as you have to now. It is now part of that blend about being, running a business and things that maybe you don't have a degree in HR. I feel like over the last 3 to 4 years I've probably earned an honorary degree in human resources just on the different ways to deal with things. So I think those are some of the key dynamics to think about. For just the overall return to office. Alessandra, did you have anything else you wanted to add there, or can
Sure,
move
I'd
on
love
the
to jump in
yeah.
on the productivity.
Yeah.
I think this is probably where the most tension comes in from a management standpoint is, one, it was that transition into remote work, and now that transition back into kind of this like hybrid role of in office, out of office, and trying to performance manage. And that's really what it comes down to, is performance management in this remote workspace. So you still need to engage with your team, making sure that you're still having those regular touch points. And then, as we said earlier, document those touch points and making sure that you're still adhering to the metrics and whatever performance standards that you're supposed to have with the employees, that you're still having those conversations, you're still documenting things. Timekeeping is a huge piece of that, making sure that people are recording when they're in attendance, that they're still taking their regular, depending on what state you're in. If you're in California, where there's a rule for everything, meal and rest breaks. So in the hybrid world or the remote world that you're operating in, performance management is even more important, particularly when you're not actually having that face time, and making sure that what you're communicating is clear, that there are written records of those communications, and then the way you're communicating, setting that expectation of what those regular, consistent performance management meetings look like. It's very easy to, we say it, out of sight, out of mind, where you're not around, and then no one's really tracking your productivity. There's tracking software that comes with its own host of issues in terms of employee privacy issues, but for the most part, as a standard baseline, continuing to performance manage people, even though they're remote and they're not there for an in-person conversation, that's still critical.
Thanks for that. Moving on to sort of managing remote and hybrid, and I added in-house here because I'm saying that because there are folks who like to be in 5 days a week, and I want to touch on that. I don't want to forget about those folks that we all used to be, or most of us used to be 5 days a week. Those folks still exist and they're still around. One of the things to think about this is, though, managers, a direct supervisor could be in a different location. It could be in a different part of the country than someone else. You may have a remote manager or a remote employee who has, the opposite of their staff member or their team member. All of those things are very important to keep in mind. And, what are the specific rules for remote employees, especially if they're MLOs? We talk about the remote rules with California. But most states have, some guidance that's out there. There's some uniform guidance that was proposed by the Mortgage Bankers Association, and states have started to adopt that. But with most guidance that's provided, it's not overly prescriptive all the time. And so you have to create your own policies around this. What does this look like? Some companies may require even an affidavit around, making sure that someone who's remote is ensuring that documentation is secure, or they don't have access to it. They're not printing things. Obviously there's a lot of technology things to implement around this, but as you allow more remote employees or even hybrid, because they still, are in that bucket, what are those specific rules and documentation that you have? I think that's a big thing to show, or to have available to show when you have that on-site exam, that you are adequately supervising those employees. And so the more information you have there that can be tested and to proof that out is key. And again, that may look different, for someone who is fully remote, who is in the office 5 days a week, or has some combination thereof. I mentioned, some folks, like to be in the office 5 days a week. If the rest of the team isn't in those 5 days, what does that look like if the copier breaks? What does that look like if there's some other issue? What if it happens if, there's something that goes wrong in the office, but the other folks who typically would take care of that aren't there? Sometimes that can lead to individuals doing things that may not necessarily be part of their job description, especially if they're an MLO. If they're spending time fixing a copier for whatever reason or whatever that is, that takes away from what their core function is. And then does that develop or build on, additional concern around what folks are doing that may, again, cause them to think about, hey, this just isn't working for me, I'm going to go somewhere else. So keep that in mind, that as the more people are returning to the office, there's also, that need for support, in those functions for folks to be there as well, so that the folks that are in the office aren't the ones cleaning out the refrigerator, aren't the ones who, unless it's part of their core job, that they understand that they will continue to have that support. One of the examples, like we even have here, we're on a shared floor here in a high rise here in Chicago. Well, the building management during the pandemic had, cut down on just the shared restroom cleaning. Well, as more people have come back, we've noticed, things aren't getting replaced. There's no paper towels, there's no soap. They hadn't adjusted to that yet. Those are the things to think about as you're running a business. Those are very practical things that, in the past, maybe we didn't have to think about. Having core days for the team, especially those that are interacting, helps build that camaraderie. If you have people staggered throughout, and everybody's there certain days, but they're not there together, what's the point? The point isn't just making sure that they're showing up to do their job. It's there so that they can learn from others. So thinking about what are those core days, how are folks getting together is really really important as you're building this out. Again, something we didn't really have to think about before. The other piece here is some of these items can be very role specific. So there are certainly jobs that can be done fully remotely, right? We all know that. But there are a lot of jobs that, from just the actual what you're doing day to day, from a risk perspective, may require you to be in the office more often than maybe others. So for example, here, as we assist clients with licensing and examinations, and for as much progress has been made to make things electronic, there is still a lot that is in paper form. Whether this is a paper fingerprint card that has an officer's biometric information on it, whether it's personal financial statement information, whether it's other client confidential information, the last thing you want is having that at one of your new entrants at their home, and then all of a sudden realizing, hey, they got robbed and maybe there was a breach of PII. So you're never going to do that. You shouldn't do that. So there are things that are going to be core that have to be done in the office, and there's just not any question around it. And that, again, may cause some concerns with folks, again, based on what their very specific role is, whether or not they should be in the office or not. So just, again, things to think about and to be very clear, especially as you're hiring new folks, as we're, going through and progressing on that piece, just to keep in mind. And Alessandra, do you have anything? Yep.
Yeah, so just to kind of jump on some of those things that you were talking about. So in terms of policies that are really important is ensuring that there are in the employee handbook, for instance, that you have confidentiality, proprietary information policies about what the company does to protect its proprietary information, and then ensuring that that definition of confidential information includes various exam or regulatory related documents. Because something that we definitely saw in the rise of remote work was the tendency to email work documents to your personal email address for convenience purposes, whether people are working off of a cloud, and the way that just sends shockwaves of nervousness down your spine when you learn that something that is regulatory, something that has client information, something that has company information is now going through the unsecured Gmail web address or heaven forbid, someone has a Hotmail or AOL account and it's going to one of those emails, that is definitely something you want to mitigate against, and that comes down to the policies that you have. In addition to the confidentiality policy, having a technology policy that also makes very clear that the technology and the information belongs to the company, and that there's the right to inspect what is transmitted through the company. And so that is one of the ways you can also catch stuff that might go across the wire. And then jumping on a little bit more of the remote policies, people that are working from home, a couple of things to think through. Something you might not realize is workers' comp policies. If you're not letting your workers' comp carrier know that you have remote employees, that could jeopardize your coverage. We have had a situation where someone tripped over their cat going to the fridge on their break and sued for workplace injury. So these are just things to keep in mind. Same thing with meal and rest breaks. People that work from home, still entitled to them, still need to make sure that you're enforcing those policies, because yes, we do see people that sue in states where it's applicable that they were not provided their meal and rest breaks. I don't know what troll is living under the fridge that's preventing them from being able to go take a break when they're working in their own residence. But that does happen, and we do get those lawsuits. Also overtime for people that are not exempt, that are hourly employees, making sure that you're also monitoring that, as that is definitely something, particularly here in California, that we see coming out of the remote working world that we're now in, is lawsuits that for overtime, meal and rest breaks, as well as sort of the cases that come out of related workers' comp injuries, but just things to be mindful of. That's where I was talking about earlier, the time and attendance stuff, making sure that you're still enforcing it as if people were in the office. A really good practice is to make sure that you're regularly communicating the meal and rest break policies as well as overtime policies, and having people maybe on a quarterly basis certify that they are regularly provided their meal and rest breaks. So I know it seems rather draconian and just like fun police over here with the policies, but they're all designed to sort of curb and address things that we're seeing on the ground with different lawsuits that have come in the remote working space.
Thanks for those examples. I will make sure next time I'm home. Well, thankfully I'm not in California, so if I trip over my dog when I'm going, I won't have any recourse maybe. But no, that's interesting. Again, examples of things that we hadn't really seen, or at least maybe not at this level to date. So the last sort of theme I wanted to touch on was just is around MLO enhanced requirements, and how does all of this impact MLOs in particular? Since this is California Mortgage Bankers Association, obviously want to talk about and draw your attention to the rules that were published earlier this year. It does provide the guidance around California MLOs under the REMLA, or Residential Mortgage Lending Act, and where it allows the performance of limited functions at a remote location. And it is pretty interesting to go through the items. Even has guidance around multiple individuals working from the same home, which I guess could be a scenario that's encountered. But it does talk about the normal, what you would expect, cybersecurity, which continues to be a focus area of all state regulators, and state regulators across the board are continuing to get trained on this, and it is changing not just for MLOs, but I know we're kind of focusing on that, but as a company, you may want to again make sure that is all shored up, and take a look at those. I think I have a link later that as these slides are provided. If you haven't seen those, this very specific California rules are there. One of the continued pieces I think that we'll see over the next couple of years, we saw it during the pandemic, was states have different standards on where you're reporting work locations for your individuals, and this can get a little tricky, especially if you have an individual who works from home, who works from one or more offices, a branch office, maybe the main office as well. And there's been overall, some general silence from the states around this, but those of you that are compliance minded, these are the types of things that keep you up at night, because you want to make sure you're doing everything as the states are expecting. So for example, you may have an individual who's licensed in California and Washington, and California says, yep, they can work remotely. Just make sure that their registered location or where they're tied to is either the main location or a branch in California. And then states like, if they're also licensed in Washington, they'll allow the person's home to be licensed as a branch location, which opens up a whole other thing, because that then becomes publicly available information on NMLS consumer access. Does somebody really want their home there? But it's, again, we're seeing this on a higher level than we did before. While this issue has always existed, it just wasn't at the forefront of what we were dealing with every day. This topic did come up in the NMLS Ombudsman last month, and I think there was a very practical question that was put out there, and while it's related to how you do this in NMLS, I think it will drive the conversation with the states around policies of what do you do, like how do you actually report this, and what are the expectations around it. Again, it's probably not something that is terribly important, other than they just want to make sure that if I'm working from my home or working from a branch, that there's a branch manager, again, that's supervising my activities, which, again, branch managers, while they may be a licensed MLO, really have to be in the branch as well. So if you're continuing that model, keep all of those things in mind. But I think there's a lot more that will be coming down that path. The last kind of pieces that I wanted to talk about before I show you a quick map and some resources, and then Alessandra can continue. One of the things we always like to think about is, what's the impact of AI? You may think like, what does it matter here? Like, does it have an impact? I think part of it is, there are a lot of things around the corner that we're not anticipating. Will AI or will different things influence how regulators view rules around MLOs, review rules around MLO remote? I don't know. I think it's something that you should, consider what's developing out there. Are there easier ways to, not just impersonate, but also create things through the use of AI? Obviously, has a lot of good uses and tools that are out there. But I will tell you, at some point, there will likely be something that a regulator latches onto in this space that will impact how MLO remote and other remote rules are brought forth by the states. And then, last, I think one of the things that was also somewhat apparent during the pandemic was a lot of the hesitancy or even the aggressiveness of some state regulators in this space was driven not because of the business and where all of that was going, but it could be driven also through sort of the governor by himself or herself around what is their overall agenda about, quote, getting people back to work, getting people in the office, and what is their posture. And that can influence how a state regulator, state financial services regulator in particular, may implement some of these policies. So that's something to keep in mind as things, continue. I think we're having more conversations about this. I think folks have gotten more comfortable around remote in general. But as we now have introduced this return to office, how do we now blend all of these things together? Where does all of this go? I think is something that is not going to be a topic that's settled anytime soon. And Melissa, who was on earlier, she and I attend a lot of conferences together. I think this is, again, one of the topics that just, continues and is something that, a few years ago we weren't really dealing with at this same level, but it's here. So those are the main themes I wanted to talk about. On the next slide, wanted to just, again, point you to a couple resources. This is on the MBA's website for the licensing flexibility. This talks about different pending legislation, as well as enacted legislation for remote work, specifically around MLOs. Florida is one of the recent ones. Nevada also earlier this year, provided or enacted guidance around this. Again, I would use this as a good resource. There is a little bit, I think, of a lag here, but not too much. But I think it's a great way to just kind of stay on top of things that are happening among the states in this area. And then the last slide, just a couple more resources that I had. Again, there's the link for the California remote guidance. I mentioned McKinsey and Company. I don't have a link specific because there's a lot there, but going back to the productivity, motivation, mental health, they've done a lot of studies. They have a lot in that area. If you're interested in learning more about that and getting your honorary HR degree, I think it's a good resource for you to think about there. And then lastly, I did want to just mention one of the changes under the CFL in California may not impact many of you, but for those of you that do have that license for brokering, they made some changes related to their the disclosure of officers that are employees. In the past, you had to ensure that you had a branch location if your officer was working outside of the main location. Now they have rules that allow for the individual, again, to continue in their capacity, but a branch license may not be required. So I think that's interesting, and how they're applying it is still TBD and not necessarily consistent, but it is something that I think is a recognition under the law, which the CFL law is, one of the more complex amongst the states, that it does at least open the door and recognizes that someone in a position of authority can work from a location, even on a temporary basis or on an occasional basis, that isn't necessarily the main license location, and actually still do a good job and actually still be able to effectively manage without having a quote branch license there. Again, not sure what that branch license does exactly. I'm not sure that it gives a guarantee that someone's not going to go off the rails, but I think at least, again, it's opening the door and a recognition that some of the regulatory pieces that have been put in place may be open to consideration for revision when it comes to this. So with that, I'll thank you for the time, and Alessandra, I'll turn it over to you to continue with your slides.
Sounds good. So regulatory ambiguity is also sometimes the theme when it comes to various employment law issues. We can go through some of these slides here because we kind of covered some of the topics earlier. There's a remote workers workstation in action. We can keep going, kind of past the timekeeping practices, because I think we already covered that pretty substantially. We go to the expense reimbursement. There we go. So this is California specific, but various states do have expense reimbursement pieces, and this definitely came up during the pandemic and post-pandemic era of what is a reasonable business expense. So again, that transition into remote work, what is reasonably incurred? So if people are needing faster internet speed and it costs more, that differential. So a good rule of thumb is having an expense reimbursement policy. Stipends were also quite popular during that time period as companies have progressed towards return to work in office with an option for remote work. That does change the dynamic of whether you're obligated to actually expense reimburse. We also highly recommend having remote work agreements, meaning that it kind of sets the parameters for what remote working looks like. One, recognizing that it is a privilege that is being afforded to the employee. And then also, where this comes up most often is the actual practicality of trying to litigate the issue of what is a reasonable business expense that the employee incurred. So you would need to show, for example, that your electricity bill skyrocketed such based on your work alone. And there's really nobody that's been able to come forth with some type of utility bill and demonstrating that but for remote work, I would have had lower costs. And so asking for the invoicing related to whatever expense they're seeking to reimburse is always a good rule of thumb. But again, it's reasonable business expenses. So if you're requiring somebody to use their cell phone for company work, then that would require an expense reimbursement. Typically what we see also is a stipend related to using your cell phone for work. That also comes into play when things sometimes go south in the relationship is what are people putting in text message. So what people put in email, what people put in text message, it's not something you want your grandmother to see. Don't necessarily put it in an email, don't put it in a text message, because people like me on the defense side will be seeking those text messages and emails and reviewing them once that employment relationship has gone south and has now entered the litigation phase. So again, it comes down to, we can go to the next slide, to having again, here's like examples of different types of expenses, reasonable and necessary. And then the next slide is sort of pointers here, practical considerations, having that policy, providing the supplies reasonably necessary to perform their job remotely, what we talked about before about the expense reimbursement. And then commuting is also something that has come up. If a person is fully remote and going to the office, or if someone is traveling office to office, so that what that commute looks like and the reimbursement for it. Going to the office when you are a hybrid employee or you're an in-office employee that occasionally works remote, you're not necessarily reimbursing them for driving to the office to the job that they originally had. But if they are going to different offices, particularly this comes up in the outside sales realm, and outside sales in and of itself has its own issues in the era of remote work, because many outside sales agents were working from home, not actually out on the road. And in California, that the law kind of requires, the way it works is that you're spending a certain percentage of your time out on the road. In the era of COVID, post-pandemic, people were working from home and not actually qualifying for that. And so they weren't actually exempt employees. They were misclassified as hourly employees or as exempt employees, and then an avalanche of litigation came from that time period, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that for people who are actually working at home and not actually out on the road. We can go to the next slide here. And so I want to make sure we save some time for questions. Again, so this is sort of what we were talking about before about working from home, safe spaces for employees. This kind of came up more during the pandemic time period about clean workspaces, making sure we're reporting illnesses, reporting things that were unsafe. Just make sure that you have a policy for it, because as we were talking about before, different state agencies, when they do come and do on-site inspections, are looking for things that might be unsafe, and what is your reporting mechanism for it. So having an injury illness prevention plan, some type of structure to report things that employees deem unsafe. I'm going to go to the next slide. And so here's an interesting topic that's been coming up in the era of remote work, are employees that move to other states but are performing work majority in California. This has impacts for layoff considerations. What is your home office? If you are based out of a particular office, say your office is in Houston, their closest office is in Houston, but you're located somewhere else, but you're operating out of there, do you get considered as part of that branch location for purposes of WARN Act and different layoff considerations? So some of this area is a little bit muddy. It's currently being worked through in the courts. We're seeing employees that are seeking to pursue lawsuits where they have moved to another state but are performing the majority of their work in California for California-based clients. Again, in banking and finance, in the mortgage industry, if they're performing work for loans that are being originated in California, we're seeing employees try and take advantage of the California labor laws, particularly the ones with meal and rest break, overtime, those types of issues. And so that is something that's currently a space that's seeing a lot of traction in terms of lawsuits. We're still kind of unresolved on how it works, but typically you live in another state, you're subject to that state's laws. But we are seeing a lot of entrepreneurial plaintiff attorneys seeking to apply the California Labor Code to employees that live in another state. And in particular, if they come to California for meetings, we're seeing that they're trying to attach California labor laws to those employees that travel. Next slide. Again, really the subject of these slides is understanding the laws in the particular state that you're in, that focusing on the wage and hour laws such as meal and rest break, overtime in California, as we've covered ad nauseum today, is a unique animal in terms of how those laws work, how they're enforced. And again, all of this comes down to having policies and procedures, consistently enforcing those policies and procedures fairly across the board, and setting those expectations early in the employment relationship, the offer letter, commission agreements, whatever it may be that governs that employee relationship, from the confidentiality policy to ensure that all confidential information, regulatory-wise, company-wise, employee-wise, or otherwise, stays within the confines of the company's information systems and does not actually get transmitted through personal email or otherwise, as well as the expense reimbursement policies for people that are remote, establishing a remote worker agreement. We do have templates of those for those people that are here in California, and as well as, again, the enforcement of those meal and rest break and overtime type policies. I think we can probably go to questions now, kind of based on where we're at.
All right, thank you both. We have had one question come in so far. Just a reminder, there is a Q&A dialog box. If you do have a question for Alessandra or Tim, feel free to submit that there. The first one that we've had so far is, I'd be interested to hear how folks are tracking borrower communication. Do you need company supplied devices? How do you track text messages? I'm not sure if it matters whether they are in office or remote. Not something I used to think about as much. Not sure if either of you could speak to that.
As far, I don't think I can speak well, since we're not a lender, I can't talk about that. I would say, I don't know if Melissa would have an idea on that. One thing I would say though, we are, as a law firm, and Alessandra, talks about text messages, things like that. We have made it very clear on our conversations with clients, right? And especially, there are so many different apps now, right? There's WhatsApp, there's Line, there's text messaging, there's all of these items. We have a policy as well. You can't prevent sort of that outreach, say, from a client through any one of those apps. Our policy is, if you receive something like that, that it is then put into an email, so we then have that record. So we kind of take it out of that realm, right, to make sure that it's tracked. At least we then have the record that we're required to have. I'm not sure, Melissa, if you have anything that might be applicable or an example to address that.
No, and I missed the first part. My audio went out for what that question was, Sam. So can you repose it for me?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear how folks are tracking borrower communication. Do you need company supplied devices? How do you track text messages? I'm not sure it matters whether they are in office or remote. Not something I used to think about as much.
Yeah, so I actually would look at Alessandra on that one too, just in regards to, you've got issues probably of personal cell phones, right? Making phone calls, text messages, what you allow, what you pay for. I mean, Alessandra might not even want to talk to it, but I think that it's not just a state licensing law situation. You're also looking at kind of like the individual personal mix with business and how you balance that out from a communication perspective.
Yeah, I'd say that one, driving things towards email where it's in a protected environment, because cell phones are not necessarily the safest way of communicating various pieces of information. Not sure you necessarily want borrower information on your personal cell phone in a text message. That does create issues for different companies. So say that certain cell phones are like hacked or anything like that. You then have these reporting requirements should there be some type of breach, information breach. So we want to avoid those types of things. So I think it's always safer to try and direct conversations and information sharing that's going to contain non-public financial information for borrowers to email some type of protected environment.
All right, thank you. That's the only question we've had come in so far. I don't know if Michael or Melissa, you guys had anything else you want to add while we have a few minutes left, or any questions you have.
Well, I'll speak real quick to one of the comments Tim had, and I didn't want to interject when he was on such a roll, but he did allude to some of the conversations we've been having as it relates to the state laws, and they're kind of wanting to know where someone is working, so from what location they're working. And you know, I think it's an interesting topic because at least from a lot of the state laws, it speaks to the fact that you can work remote. But you could have, think of, you know, if you have a hybrid loan officer, right? So working from home and working in the office. Let's say you have a loan officer that's is, you know, attached 100% in the office, but they have to take 3 days away to go to their son's hockey tournament, right? And they want to be able to work from their hotel at the same time. And maybe that state allows that. So one of the things that I've kind of called out for what the regulators wanting us to say is an LO remote or are they working in the office, is if the state allows remote, it's not prescriptive that it has to be at home and it has to be either 100% of the time or no percent of the time. It's saying that you can work remote, and that's how the model law was put together, right? It wasn't to call out the person's individual residence. So with that being said, I think my first thought is that if the state allows remote, you're going to click the box that they work remote and in the office, right? Just in the case that they have something that takes them out of the office where they're working remote, which is completely compliant with the state regulations. So that's to, you know, there's more discussion, I know, being had by the regulators and the system and everything like that. So don't take that takeaway as like, oh, I got to go look in the NMLS and see what's happening in there. It's not there if you were to go look at it. But it is something that the regulators are discussing, is how now do they kind of embrace this remote legislation that many of the states have passed, and how do they also, how much do they need to know where someone is actually working versus what they declare, you know, as their branch location.
You don't think that there'll be a uniform remote work by all 50 states? We'll eventually get to that, or you think it's always going to be individual, state by state, case by case?
I'll put my opinion, Tim, but I think it's always going to be individual because it's all state level regulation, right? So it's the beauty of federalism as well, which is the fact that the states can kind of determine that. And I haven't seen any move at the federal level to make it, you know, a nationwide law. And I don't even think there's that possibility. I think we went through a lot of that in the early stages of the pandemic, of figuring out how to approach remote. So with the benefit though, Michael, is that a model law was drafted by a few of us in the industry and then worked through the advocacy, whether it's like through, you know, organizations like the California MBA, but other state level, you know, organizations to be able to, you know, give that model law. So then as the states adopted it, hopefully it was more or less similar, right? So we weren't having to deal with, you know, 60 plus different versions of what they define remote to be, especially because in the beginning, right, Tim, they were saying remote was your home. They were saying it was working from home. Well, that's tough, right? So we got them to realize, okay, just say remote, don't say work from home, it's work remotely. But then some of the things that needs to be required for that, like IT security, you know, Citrix environments, privacy, some of the other things that they kind of layered into that. So you still have to look at the states one by one for some of those requirements. Like Oregon definitely has some interesting call outs. I would say, I think Connecticut has some, every state basically has some difference within their state law, but like we're trying to make sure that the base is similar. So it also, it's like job security or something too, you know. All of it. So, Tim and I, you know, just on the edge of our seat all the time.
Can't get rid of us. Yeah, I would say, I mean, to add on to that, like Melissa said, I mean, I don't see that going away so that it is completely the same for all states. I think the model law that Melissa's talking about is great because I think it moves the needle enough like to have a critical mass for the states. But I think I'd mention briefly, I mean, just like state by state, just the political considerations, and has nothing to do with mortgage, right, necessarily. It's just sort of, whatever the administration's priorities are and whether or not they want to pursue it, or like in some states maybe like, you know what, no, we want all of our state employees back, we want everyone back, we're not going to support any changes to the law that are going to open the door to this. So I think that you're always going to have that, and then you may have a state, I'm just saying South Dakota because it's top of mind, not that this is a real example, that one year is not open to it, the next year is open to it. So again, we'll keep changing and adjusting, but I think the model law has opened the door to at least moving the needle forward in a good way for a lot of the states.
And maybe I'll follow up with a second question for both of you is, what do you tell a mortgage company that has LO that Tim Lang works in Chicago 6 months out of the year and then goes to Florida because it's too cold for the other 6 months out of the year? What are the best practices that they should be implementing pre-Tim going to Florida and, on an ongoing basis, since they're with remote work, people can work pretty much anywhere. It's really hard to control. So Tim and Alessandra, sure there's a number of variables that go into that, but what would you tell a mortgage company? You got another hour?
Yeah, I was like, oh, wow. So a couple of things is making sure that employees report where they're actually working, because that's definitely something that came out of the pandemic, is people moving and not disclosing where they were. And then that creating actual issues from like sort of a tax perspective as well, from state to state in employment taxes. So ensuring that is being reported, because then it also just changes sick leave laws, or a whole host of problems could come from it. But basically it comes down to where are you working, report where you're working, and then having an understanding of sort of what are the particular wage and hour laws in that state, if any. So if someone is going from California to Missouri, it's a completely different environment. What would be applicable to that employee that's now gone to Missouri, or vice versa. If someone has been induced to moving to a particular state based on a job, and if you're having layoffs in the future, or that position might get eliminated. In California, there are laws that deal with that type of inducement to move, and lawsuits that can come from that. So really, at the end of the day, it comes down to communication, documentation, and engagement with your team, and knowing where they are and what they're doing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all we have. Alessandra and Tim, thank you so much for your time and knowledge on this topic. As a reminder, this was recorded and it'll be on our MQAC committee page probably by the end of the day, or at least by tomorrow, to reference it. Any last words you have, Michael, to wrap us up?
I'll just take a poll. Who's wearing shoes today?
It's not for footwear, though.
Oh, yeah. The heels are gone.
Just a reminder, December Legal Issues Regulatory Conference registration is open. Anybody interested in sponsoring? We have open sponsorships. A few of those are left, so reach out if you are interested, and see a lot of you in December. So Tim, Alessandra, thank you so much. This was such a great webinar. Thank you for dropping knowledge on this topic, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. Take care.
Thanks.